Consumer and producer surplus. Consumer surplus is found above the equilibrium price. Consumer surplus. Everyone has different tastes, incomes, and views on how much they're prepared to pay for a good or service. When a consumer pays less for a good than the amount they're prepared to pay for it, this amount of money is known as the consumer surplus. For example, if someone was prepared to pay £10 for a good and bought it for £8, then the consumer surplus, this area here, would be £2. So the consumer surplus is the difference between the price that the consumer is willing to pay for a good or service and the price that they actually pay. So what we can do is go, well, we've got £2 here, there's our £2, and we can times that by the quantity. So let's say there's 10 units bought. So what's going to happen, we will end up with a total area of 2 times 10, which equals £20. We obviously have to find half that area, so we divide it by 2. So that will tell us that our consumer surplus is £10. So the total consumer surplus, the total size of this red triangle, is £10. So repeat, there's 10 here, there's 2 here, that area is worth 20, we divide it by 2 and we get to a £10 consumer surplus. Producer surplus is below the equilibrium price. Different producers have different costs when making goods and services. If a producer receives more for a product or service than the price they're willing to accept, the extra earnings are known as producer surplus. For example, if the equilibrium price of a good is £15, but the supplier would be happy to sell for £10, then the producer surplus would be £5. So the producer surplus is the difference between the price that the producer is willing to supply a good or service at and the price that they actually receive for it. It should be also noted that as the quantity increases to, say, 2 units maybe, you can see that now there's a firm is only willing to produce the product at, say, £11. So let's say that's £11. Consequently, the consumer surplus now will only be £4. If it gets to £12, surplus will be £3. So you get the idea of why it has this triangular shape. To work out the size of the total producer surplus, it's calculated in exactly the same way as I showed with consumer surplus. So you times whatever the surplus is, times by the quantity of units, you divide by 2. Also, it should be pointed out that consumer surplus is calculated in a very similar way to producer surplus, as we've just shown. So let's summarise this. The consumer surplus is the area found below the demand curve, yet above the equilibrium price. The producer surplus is the area above the supply curve, but below the equilibrium price. Changes in supply and demand affect consumer and producer surplus. Anything that causes a shift in the supply or demand curve can lead to a change in the price of a good. A change in price will bring a good closer to or further away from the amount the buyer was willing to pay or the supplier was willing to sell for, and this will change the consumer and producer surplus. A shift in the supply curve, so a shift in the supply curve from S to S1 means the price will increase from PE to P1, and quantity will decrease from Q to Q1. The consumer surplus will change as well. So I'm just going to note that on the diagram so you can see. So originally, let's thicken the pen slightly so it's easier for you to see. So originally, the consumer surplus was this area. So the consumer surplus was PE. So I'm going to write that here. The original consumer surplus was PE, X and V. Okay, but when supply shifted to the left, the consumer surplus reduced by this quantity here. So we have to call this a reduction in consumer surplus of P1, Y, PE and X. So that's the reduction in consumer surplus. The new consumer surplus would be this area here. So new consumer surplus is the area P1, Y, V and V. The original producer surplus, on the other hand, was PE to W, X to PE. So PE, W, X was original producer surplus. However, once supply shifted to the left, so let's put original down first of all, original PS, X, W, PE. So once the supply shifted to here, we'll change the colour once more, the new producer surplus was obviously much smaller. It was, so new PS was Z, and it was then PE, and we'll just put a letter in here to finish. Let's call that, I don't know, C, ZPC. Now, the problem you've got with that is not the new producer surplus if you look more carefully, because look, if I go to here, P1 is the new market price once supply shifted to the left. So the producer surplus actually is not this figure here, as you might first think. Instead, the producer surplus would be P1Z to Y. So that's our new producer surplus and our new consumer surplus. Okay, so let's see what happens now when the demand curve shifts to the left. Let's say there's a fall in income and consumers demand less of the given product. Now, originally, so we look here, let demand shifted straight away to there. The original consumer surplus, however, was at PE. So that was our original consumer surplus. I'm not going to put the letters on this time. So it was all this area here was our original consumer surplus. The area below was original producer surplus. So all of this area here. Now, what's happened is that once the demand curve is shifted to the left, you can see that the demand curve, so let's make that nice and clear so we know what we're talking about on that one. This part here, look, there's my demand curve. There, look. So you can see the consumer surplus is no longer this big yellow triangle. I'll put it in a different colour. It's now instead this purple triangle that goes down as far as here. So that would be new consumer surplus. So it's much smaller than the original yellow triangle, whilst the previous blue producer surplus is now much smaller, and that will be the new producer surplus. So price elasticity of demand and consumer surplus is the next thing I'm going to talk about. So I want you to imagine that it's the demand for cigarettes. Now you can see that here the demand for cigarettes is extremely inelastic. I suppose I should put on demand and supply. There's my P1. There's my Q1, there's Q, there's P. So my original consumer surplus is really, really large. It's all this area here. Now what I'm going to do is show you that if the demand were to become elastic, so in this case that's elastic, and I'm going to take out that previous inelastic curve. So you can see that this one now, the previous curve was demand inelastic, this one's demand elastic. And hopefully you have seen that the consumer surplus is much smaller. If demand was to become, oh, that's pretty poorly drawn, even more elastic, the consumer surplus gets even smaller. Eventually, when the demand becomes perfectly, let's rub that out, we're getting a little confusing. If we rub it out completely, that line, and I put perfectly elastic, that means there is absolutely zero consumer surplus. There is no consumer surplus whatsoever. In other words, if the price was to even increase by 1 pence, demand would completely stop for it. The consumer would not even pay a penny more than the price they are currently paying. So a final thought here, labelling and explaining consumer surplus. So each time you talk about consumer surplus and producer surplus, you need to maybe create a key, as I've shown there with the various letters on the earlier diagrams we looked at, or by shading it in. I suggest you do it with a key. You mark in what is the original and what is the new, beg your pardon, new consumer surplus. Obviously, if you didn't produce a surplus, that needs to be noted. But when you show the change, just think twice about that. You have to say whether it's increased, an increase in consumer surplus or a decrease. So I'll show you what I mean now with one final example. So let's say here, there's my demand curve, and let's say the price of the good has fallen. So I'm not compelled to put a supply curve on here. I might want to put it on afterwards if I so wish. In fact, I might show you that. But I've got A, B and C. So my original consumer surplus equals A. My new consumer surplus is A, B and C. Now, a very weak student would put down changing consumer surplus B. Now straight away we're going to put a red line through that because that's hopeless. Because look, the change in the consumer surplus is not just B, for starters, and it's not even called a change. The triangle has got larger. That was my original, that's my new. So I'm going to jot down here that and rub this out as well, that there's been an increase in consumer surplus, and that equals an increase of BC. Thank you very much for listening.